Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our Colby Book Prize presentation. I'm Jennifer Fegley, and I'm the current president of RSVP for just a few more weeks here. And I'm very excited about this talk today. I just want to say what an important prize this Colby Award is to our organization, and how excited I am to honor Prithi with this award. So the Colby Prize, if you don't know, honors the memory of Robert Colby and his wife Vineta, distinguished scholars and longtime RSVP members. The Colby Prize pays tribute to an original book-length work on Victorian periodicals and newspapers of the kind that Robert and Vineta Colby themselves produced during their careers. The annual prize is awarded to a book published during the preceding year that most advances our understanding of the 19th century British press. This year's winner, of course, as I've already indicated, is Prithi Joshi for her outstanding book, Empire News, the Anglo-Indian Press Writes India, published by SUNY Press. The prize committee praised Empire News as a valuable, innovative, and timely study that brings to life the circulations of English language newspapers published in mid-century India with an immaculate level of care and attention to archival detail. According to the committee, the book compellingly illuminates the ways in which the empire was not a monolithic construct of the press, but an often contradictory space of competing voices shaped by the journalistic need for copy, access to sources, and volatility in the business of press production. As Joshi notes in her introduction, the book traces the material circulations of a set of Anglo-Indian newspapers, their circuits and routes, editors and printers, exchanges and borrowings, even as it is alert to their moments of rupture. Focusing on the Uprising of 1857 and a sensational trial involving the British East India Company as key events, this book, according to Joshi, examines the making and breaking of empire. Prithi is the Susan Resnick Pierce Professor of Humanities and Honors at the University of Puget Sound, where she teaches 19th century British literature, culture, and empire, with a secondary specialization in post-colonial literatures and film. She's a 2022-23 MC Lang Fellow at the Rare Book School at UVA, and is excited to help develop a culture of the book as an artifact at Puget Sound. Prithi's first RSVP presentation, which was also the first related to the book Empire News, was given at the University of Roehampton in 2008. She has led students from her campus in study away programs in India and Southeast Asia, and is committed to increasing opportunities for global connections between partners in India and students and scholars in the US. She is currently working on a book-length study entitled For Illustrative Purposes Only, From Lithography to Photography in Indian Periodicals of the 19th Century. So help me give a warm welcome to Prithi this afternoon or evening, wherever you are. And I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I will start my screen share, and as happens in screen shares, if somebody can tell me that you're seeing my screen and not presentation mode, is that good? Okay. And of course, as also happens, thank you, as also happens with screen share, you can only see one or two people. So if something is off, please don't use chat, just unmute yourself and interrupt me and tell me if I'm like way off or if I'm doing something that's not okay. So, sorry, 1 second. I just lost my presentation. There, can you see my presentation? Yes, okay. Many thanks to Jennifer for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm coming to you from Tacoma, Washington, where I live and work on the lands of the Puyallup tribe. Despite a history of displacement and broken treaties, the Puyallup people have endured. Their history and persistence calls on people like me who have settled on their ancestral and stolen lands to recenter them and their experiences particularly as we speak, as we are doing at this conference, about survival, history, and marginalization. I want to begin with much gratitude to the Colby judges for this honor. When I started this project almost 15 years ago, I had no idea that there was a book in it, much less one that others would find interesting or worthwhile. Nor could I have planned the convergence between this year's conference topic, Margin, Limit, Periphery, Edge, and my book. One of the newspapers I write about is called The Mufassalite. We move to the next slide, yes? Okay. One of the newspapers that I write about is called The Mufassalite. The name is an anglicization of an Urdu word, mufassal, that means to classify or divide, and that by the late 18th century had been absorbed into the Anglo-Indian vernacular to mean provincial. Empire News is very much about a mufassal or marginal or peripheral press. And in that, it follows in the footsteps of so many at RSVP who have foregrounded marginal works, voices, and press cultures. Andrew Hobbs, Alexis Easley, Carolyn Bressie, to name only a few recent colleagues, and Sally Mitchell, Rosemary Van Arstel, Joanne Shattuck, Anne Humphreys, Brian Maidman, if one browses in the first decades of VPR, as I recently had occasion to do. Indeed, when we look to the early days of our organization, we are reminded that the study of periodicals was initially viewed as a marginal enterprise, something a handful of literary scholars did on the edges of real literary work. And Patrick Leary's recent article in VPR about Houghton, Altick, and the Wellesley Index tells a really terrific slice of this history. To be awarded the Colby Prize then by this organization and recognized at this conference feels particularly meaningful. I'm humbled and grateful as well to be in the company of the colleagues who published books in 2021 and made this a bumper crop year of exciting work to be studying 19th century British periodicals. Many of these people are folks whose footsteps I'm literally following in. Others have been fellow travelers for years. I have and continue to learn from them, and I'm proud to be part of this very rich cohort. My comments today are organized in 4 sections. I'll begin by sharing some of the large questions that prompted my book and that it is an effort to engage with and intervene in. I'll then briefly offer an overview of the book, share one concrete example, and end with some directions the book has led me to in my current work. So Jennifer, Catherine, I can see you. Can you give me a thumbs up if my slide moved? Okay, super. Part 1, Archival and Colonial Matters. Empire News, the Anglo-Indian Press Writes India, is about the English language, largely British press in India between 1845 and 1860. These were the years right before and immediately following the 1857 Uprising, sometimes erroneously referred to as the Mutiny. These years represent the twilight of the East India Company, the trading firm that had, like a gouty landlord, grown to immense and grotesque proportions as it morphed into the government of India and was finally laid to rest in 1858. I turn to this archive because, though there is some very good work by Indian and Pakistani scholars chronicling the explosion of journalism on the subcontinent in the 19th century, there was very little critical study of the newspapers and periodicals of the period, whether English or vernacular language press. In addition to attending to a neglected archive, I wanted to explore ways new or unexamined archives can reorient our understanding of old questions. I sought to redirect a line of inquiry that had started to feel a little threadbare to me. I wanted to write not another monograph about how empire was challenged or subverted or about the resistors, but rather about how empire was reproduced. In approaching the archive of mid-19th century Indian newspapers, I positioned myself at the intersection of British 19th century studies, post-colonial studies, and print culture or history of the book or periodical studies. I'm a literary scholar who works in archives that are filled with gaps and silences. These archival gaps forced me to approach the past like a historian. In that endeavor, one of my principal guides has been the historian Michel Rolfe-Triot, whose 2015 book, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, is indispensable for thinking about the many lives of histories. Beginning with the simple reminder that the term history refers both to what happened in the past and to narrative accounts of the past, Triot argues that human beings participate in history both as actors and as narrators. They are engaged, he continues, simultaneously in the socio-historical processes and in narrative constructions of those processes. This insight, where newspapers are concerned, invites us to think of newspapers as more than a window into a moment, that way of thinking leads, as Mark Turner gestured yesterday, to a mining or extractive approach to newspapers. Rather than that mining approach, we think of them as part of the making of a moment. Newspapers are historical records, the first rough draft of history, as they're often referred to, and those who make them are both historians, but also participants or agents in the history they record or produce. In a colonial space, newspapers played a few additional roles. They were central to modernity and to the formation of modern institutions and citizens. Benedict Anderson, of course, made this argument in regards to newspapers and nationalism quite some time ago. In The Black Hole of Calcutta, his exploration of the spaces for the development of colonial citizenship, Partha Chatterjee nuances Anderson's argument. Chatterjee looks to James Augustus Hickey, the Briton who started the subcontinent's first print paper in 1780. Though Hickey is considered a thoroughly scurrilous chap, Chatterjee views his newspaper and work as, quote, the first forum in Bengal where the government's policies could be publicly debated. In the late 18th and early 19th century, many Indians and Britons in India, whom I shall refer to throughout as Anglo-Indian, many Indians and Anglo-Indians entered the space that Hickey's Bengal Gazette opened to debate the government's policies. Thus, James Silk Buckingham edited an Indian language newspaper for which he was deported from India in 1823, passing the baton on to his colleague and friend, Ram Mohan Roy, who edited both the Bengali language newspaper and worked with Britons on the Unitary Repository in the 1820s. Ram Mohan Roy, Chatterjee writes, transformed the freedom of belief into the legal constitutional form of the individual subject's right to liberty, a transformation that could not have happened without his association with the emergent public sphere in Bengal of Anglo-Indian free traders and free thinkers. This is all Chatterjee's words. Newspapers in India, in other words, were a pivotal space where debates about rights occurred and where citizenship, never a colonial reality, was tested and flexed. In the colonial sphere, newspapers were vital to the formation of modernity and citizenship. Notwithstanding interventions such as Chatterjee's, the standard account of Anglo-Indian newspapers is that they were belligerent bullhorns for empire and functioned in isolation from their vernacular language contemporaries. While there is some accuracy to this description, the relationship between Indians and Anglo-Indians was, I argue, more transactional. The transactions I refer to are particularly evident in the print sphere, even one that was haunted by the specter of various official and unofficial forms of censorship. Financiers like Dwarkanath Tagore funded both English and vernacular language newspapers, and editors like Ram Mohan Roy wrote for both. Many Indian printers, compositors, correspondents learnt the trade in Anglo-Indian print shops and editorial offices before moving on to establish their own newspapers or periodicals. Harish Chandra Mukherjee, the editor of the Hindu Patriot, whom I discuss in a chapter on the Uprising, is one such figure. Others remain to be excavated. To speak of transactions across colonial dividing lines is not to deny the power of the colonial state. It is instead to study colonialism less as a monolith and more as, to use the anthropologist Anne Stoller's and the historian Frederick Cooper's words, as shot through with conflicts. Nathan Hensley, speaking of the British Empire, writes, "The empire was not, as Sir John Seeley put it in 1883, acquired in a fit of absence of mind, but it was nevertheless generated from an array of competing motivations, and at no point was its achievement guaranteed." Cheryl Barredo, a historian of US-Philippine relations, similarly describes the colonial project as simultaneously powerful and fragile, at once repressive and unsure, both ideally ordered and manifestly unruly. Another way to put this is, colonialism in its operations was fissured, and it is these fissures or tensions of empire, as Stoller and Cooper call them, that open spaces for colonized peoples to insert themselves. In my estimation, print culture is one of the best places to witness the workings of these fissures, particularly in India, where newspapers and periodicals played a central role in the development of anti-colonial nationalism, of vernacular languages, and of modernity. Part 2, Shifting Certainties. Empire News analyzes how ideas of empire circulated and reproduced, and how newspapers managed or negotiated crises or conflicts of empire. My sample consists of a number of English language newspapers, with these 5 newspapers at the core. The 4 on the periphery were edited by Anglo-Indians, the one in the center, the Hindu Patriot, by an Indian. In addressing questions of circulation and crises, this book takes up 2 tenets. I came to think of them as shibboleths about periodicals and periodicals of empire. The first, that the provincial press was, well, provincial. And the second is that the Anglo-Indian press was a mouthpiece of imperial policy. Anglo-Indian newspapers in the 19th century were critical to circulating ideas of empire, only not necessarily in ways we might imagine. One of the axioms among scholars writing about the British Empire in India is that the Anglo-Indian press, like Anglo-Indians, was virulently racist, foaming at the mouth and stoking racial tensions. My work in the archive of 19th century newspapers indicates that there were certainly bloody representations and violent language used to describe Indians, particularly during the 1857 Uprising. And this, by the way, was both in the Anglo-Indian press and, of course, the British press. But in the 20 years prior to the Uprising, the target of most Anglo-Indian newspapers' vitriol was the government of India, which was the East India Company. Though the newspapers I look at, these 5 here are the central ones, although I look at about a dozen others, though the newspapers I looked at represent a range of the political spectrum, none spared the government or governing authorities. They challenged decisions and appointments, debated and deliberated policies, and regularly upbraided the government of India, the London-based directors of the EIC, the company, Parliament, or a parliament that had oversight of the East India Company. Partha Chatterjee, writing of the first quarter of the 19th century, has characterized such unruly debate as pivotal to the collaborations between Anglo-Indian and Indian counterparts in the press, and to the development of what he refers to as the colonial early modern. Mid-century, the period my book takes up, such collaborations fractured. Nonetheless, slamming the company remained in style. In 1851, the Mufassilite described the government as utterly, quote, unsuited to the spirit of the age and the altered conditions of the country, and it insisted that great changes must take place both in the mode of governing and in the form of government. You'll notice that the paper calls for changes, not the abolition of empire. Critiques of British governance of India went hand in hand with a civilizing mission, an unquestioned certainty that India needed the British, that Britons were providing Indians tutelage. This duality, and I don't want to think of it as a contradiction, but this duality of colonial critique married to imperial certitude was a fissure that colonial subjects drew on to develop their own voices and print cultures and engagement with modernity. As for the second contention, that the provincial or Anglo-Indian press was amateur, derivative, always mimicking the London press, my book debunks that dogma as well. First, by tallying numbers. How often did Anglo-Indian newspapers cite the London or the British press? Not that often. How often did they cite other Anglo-Indian papers? Quite a bit. How often did they cite the broader regional press? A lot. Second, my book debunks this dogma by drilling into content. The metropolitan, i.e. British press, was as often as not mocked for its ignorance and routinely corrected by the Anglo-Indian press. And during the 1857 uprising, Indian newspapers used the press in Britain to express views that would have been censored by the loathed government of India, the company. In other words, the Anglo-Indian press, rather than imitating the British press, fed it ideas and used it to gain currency for their ideas about the management of the colony, which ideas were, I was quite surprised to learn, quite expansive. Two chapters of Empire News delve into moments of crisis, as Jennifer mentioned. One is an 1851 trial in India, and the second is the 1857 uprising. The 1851 trial, which I'll say more about in a moment, was a very local affair, haunted by the origins of British colonial rule in India and a harbinger for its future. The second crisis, the uprising, played out on local terrain, but had global reach and implications, not least a result of the ways that the first draft of history circulated or did not, as I detail in that chapter. The final chapter traces the travels of text from India to Britain, the repurposing of picturesque travel pieces written in a pre-1857 India to a post-1857 Britain, emphasizing generic transformations and multiple platforms, newspaper, weekly, railway series volumes, and reprint. That final chapter argues that the traffic or circulation of empire was far from unidirectional or centered to periphery. These chapters and case studies complicate the two shibboleths that have long pertained in studies of periodicals of empire, that the provincial press was provincial and that the Anglo-Indian press was an instrument of empire. Part 3, Ghosts or Empire on Travel. Empire on Trial. A little water break. Let me concordize these claims with one example of a crisis in Anglo-Indian newspapers' coverage of it. The case is a trial, the East India Company versus Jyoti Prasad, that occurred in 1851 in Agra. 1851 is, of course, the year of the Great Exhibition, the first global World's Fair. Paxton's Glass Palace was constructed for the event, and goods from world over, including, of course, India, appeared in its galleries. One item that had pride of place at the Great Exhibition, but that appeared in the building's transept, not in the India galleries, was the Kohinoor Diamond. And these are, of course, pictures that will be very familiar to you all, images. The Kohinoor Diamond was a spoil of war. Even British newspapers and Parliament referred to it as booty, an item of plunder. Obfuscating what everyone recognized, the official catalog of the exhibition, however, listed it as a gift delivered to Queen Victoria by the young son of the defeated Maharaja of Punjab. As the Kohinoor was being exhibited in London, in India, a different exhibition was unfolding. The East India Company had brought charges against an Indian businessman who had provisioned the British Army during several wars, including the Anglo-Sikh Wars of 1845 to 1849. The very wars that had yielded Britain one of the largest pieces of real estate on the subcontinent and the Kohinoor Diamond that was being exhibited in London. The government had never paid the businessman for the food, fuel, and vehicles he had provided, and its outstanding bills, almost a decade old, amounted at this point in 1851 to 5.7 million rupees, or at the exchange rate of the day, 570,000 pounds. Instead of paying Jyoti Prasad, the government brought charges against him for fraud. The Anglo-Indian Press started the year 1851 eagerly anticipating the opening of the exhibition in London, but quickly lost interest in the exhibition. Instead of the Great Exhibition, which consumed the British press, the Anglo-Indian Press devoted most of its column interest to a very local story, the Jyoti Prasad trial, a story that I argue offers a gloss on the global story of British imperialism. Rather than beholden to the London press or even to British news, the Anglo-Indian Press was embedded in its locale. The case was riveting to the Anglo-Indian media for a few reasons. Jyoti Prasad was represented and defended by a British-trained barrister, the first time this had happened in India, and the spectacle of a European defending an Indian against the British government was riveting. That barrister, moreover, was a caustic critic of the government of India and the editor of course you all will have guessed this, the Mufassalite. This editor was a man named John Lang, who hailed from Australia, who was called a larrikin, by the way. This is one of the panels I was in this morning. He was a man named John Lang, who hailed from Australia and was the grandson of a former convict from East London. The Anglo-Indian Press was almost uniformly critical of the government in bringing this case. The Bombay Times called the case that most stupendous of blunders, and it used the occasion of the trial to write about the government's, quote, long career of past misconduct and dishonest dealing, its acquisition of territory, power, and wealth by dishonest means, and the frauds it had practiced in order to take possession of lands. The Anglo-Indian Press also celebrated Jyoti Prasad's exoneration. The Bengal Harkaru maintained that the only good to come out of the unfortunate proceeding is that, quote, even in a company's court, bad as it is, even with a company's judge, even in a jury dependent on our governors in a case in which they are the prosecutors, freedom and justice are sometimes triumphant. Lang himself came to view the case in less triumphant terms and as more than a singular event, but as an instance of broader colonial injustice. At court, during the trial, in his closing statement, he charged the governor general, the lieutenant governor, the court, and the magistrates all with, quote, arbitrary power. Lang's rhetoric and language deliberately referenced Edmund Burke's charges in Parliament against Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of India in 1787. Hastings, Burke had declared, the whole history of Asia is nothing more than precedents to prove the invariable exercise of arbitrary power. Though the ghost of Burke's denunciation of imperial excess merely hovered, it never fully landed. Yet the Anglo-Indian Press's consistent condemnation of the East India Company in 1851 makes it very difficult to view that press as merely the mouthpiece of empire or stoking racial tensions. That said, the Anglo-Indian Press was committed to the imperial mission. Here is what the Bombay Times wrote at the conclusion of the trial. Quote, the trial of Jyoti Prasad would inflict an injury on our character, which half a century of good government will scarcely repair, perfectly convinced as the natives will be that our intention was to perpetuate a stupendous fraud by form of law, end quote. The concern, in other words, is not with the wrong done, but with the stain it left on the character of the British. This is, of course, colonial critique with imperial certitude. The trial that, to my knowledge, no scholar has addressed despite its considerable significance, elaborates the ways that local or peripheral archives not only contain many riches, but also that press circulations, though functioning, were not always functional. What I mean by that is that while British newspapers reported on the trial, the Times persisted in misspelling Lang's name, by the way. Though the British newspapers reported on the trial, they failed to grasp the import of the case. Only Lang in the Mufassalite, on the first anniversary of Prashad's exoneration, made the connection between the trial and the Great Exhibition. He did so by triangulating the Kohinoor, the empire's wars of expansion, and its exhibitionary self-presentation as liberal. The Punjab, Lang wrote in the Mufassalite, which, by the way, I mean, as I said at the start, this is a newspaper that viewed its marginality as an asset. So the Punjab, Lang wrote, has been annexed. The jewels of Ranjit Singh have been appraised and sold by auction. The Kohinoor has been exhibited at the greatest exhibition of all nations. And yet, the man who supplied you with food is to this hour a creditor to the government to the extent of upwards of £500,000 sterling. Lang points to the hidden, or only hidden in plain sight, cost of empire. Ultimately, though, Lang's inability to see beyond the individual, his client, meant that he could never mount more than a limited critique of empire. Part 4, pressing ahead. Empire News ends in a slight mystery, an image of Nana Sahib that appeared in the Illustrated London News. That mystery and image has served as the impetus of my current project on illustrations and images in the Indian press. In the early 19th century, the capacity for reproducing images shifted from a small-scale cottage industry to industrial production. In this scale-up of the mass production of images, I'm particularly interested in the technologies of production and in the ways in each emerging technology drew on the grammar of dominant or residual technologies, even as it developed its own syntax and grammar. If Empire News is about circulation and crisis, this project is about copying. And the questions that animate the inquiry at this stage are: 1, what happens when an image is remediated from canvas to sketch to wood or stone to paper? 2, how do images and their forms travel? And 3, what stamp does each set of hands in its industrial journey leave on the image a reader encounters in their newspaper or periodicals? I have started to build an archive of images from Indian periodicals, some by Anglo-Indians, some by Indians, some in English, some in vernacular Indian languages, some in conversation with and extending the Punch brand, others drawing on indigenous and visual traditions. I'll share here just a few images that I find intriguing as I start to dip my toes into this material. This first set of images, it's a 2-page spread, is from the Anglo-Indian Delhi sketchbook that, as far as I can tell, is the first illustrated periodical in India. This image appeared in 1853, and I include it here because I spoke about the Jyoti Prashad trial, and this is 2 years after the trial happens. It's an illustrated comic verse of the 1851 trial. I won't read it all, but this is the court that Jack built. This is the man, the judge. This is the old Jyoti, and I've sort of put little markers for Jyoti Prashad on the left and then John Lang on the right. So you can imagine my excitement when I was in the British Library this spring and I came upon this. It's almost the first thing I saw, and I almost jumped out of my seat. I'm going to share two other images, which are from the bilingual Parsi Punch, and these images are from 1884. The first image here rejects the yoking of anti-colonial nationalism, right? That's the figure Indiana on the right, with the mutiny. It's called Mutiny of 1857, and that the mutiny is referred to as a monster here. This image is a reminder that unlike for 20th century nationalists or for post-colonial scholars, the uprising, the mutiny, had a very different valence for anti-colonials in the late 19th century. I'm intrigued by what is going on in this image. And then the next image I want to share with you is also from Parsi Punch, and it captures the civil war between the Anglo-Indian and the native press, a war that really exploded in the late part of the century, but wasn't so much the case in the middle part of the century that my book was about. I have much work to do in unpacking print technologies and visual style. In this work, too, that I am embarked on, I'm drawing on the generosity and pioneering scholarship of so many RSVP colleagues who have led the way in the study of illustrations. Brian Maidman, Lorraine Jansen-Quistra, Laurel Brake, Julie Codell, Thomas Smits, Linda Hughes, Alison Headley, Lisa Surridge, and Mary Elizabeth Layton are just a few who have inspired and guided me thus far. I'm excited to be joining these colleagues in the analysis of text and image, and thrilled as well to see that there are so many young scholars who are doing pioneering work. Saurav, whom we congratulated earlier at the meeting, folks who are doing pioneering work in illustrations and periodicals, whom I continue to learn from. Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm going to try to stop share so I can see all of you. There we go. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you so much for that wonderful overview of your book and preview of your new project. Fantastic. So we can open the floor to questions. You may either raise your hand under the reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom window, or you could type in chat, or you could wave your hands around and you're on camera, but I might not see you if you're not on the first page. So that's the problem with that. I think that Marie had a question about, Marie, you might want to jump in while I try to summarize, but what difference does it make to study the periodical press, the place that it allows people in the empire to fill versus say a novel? When you mentioned early on that you were thinking of the periodical press as finding ways in which people take up space in the fissures of empire, Maria, I think you were just wondering what's the comparison?
Why is the periodical press a particularly good place to go look at their, not trying to challenge the statement, just trying to gather more information about what makes the periodical press so good at this?
Thanks for that, Marie. I think I said print culture is a particularly, in my view, print culture is a particularly rich place to see those fissures. And part of the to get at those fissures, and partly I say it because of the space of the printing, of the publishing house or printing press. I mean, to me, that space is a really central one where all kinds of exchanges happen, many of which I think will be forever lost to us, because we're talking about compositors, we're talking about folks who I don't know that we will ever be able to recover their names. I tried to get at one story about that I try to draw out in a story that's told. So this is in my 4th chapter where I'm looking at household words, actually. And we're told a story about the theft by pressmen who happened to be working in both a vernacular language newspaper, an Urdu language newspaper, and an Anglo-Indian newspaper, an English language Anglo-Indian newspaper. And to me, what's interesting in that story is the traces of friction, fissures, but also exchanges that is taking place in that press by compositors who are setting text in a language that they are probably not literate in, but they are learning the skills that they are then using in the Bengali language press that they are setting for, or the Urdu language press that they are setting for. So that's speaking specifically to newspapers, but I think the point is, and you maybe, I thought I had said print culture is the space, not periodical culture in specifics, but thank you for correcting me if I was unclear.
Okay, thank you. That's fascinating. Julie Cadell also has a question. And Julie, if you want to jump in and just speak up, that's fine too.
I was just curious about those images of women as representing the Anglo-Indian press and the Indian press, as opposed to men, but also as opposed to the lions and tigers that are often used to represent the two countries, and wonder what you make of the use of women as representatives.
Thank you, Julie, for that. And you know, your work has been so important for me as I stepped into thinking about illustrations, which I feel complete novice in, and I'm sort of ground up. India is always presented in the illustrations that I have been, you know, started looking at as a woman and as a sari-clad woman. And I think, and of course, as you're right, there's the lion, tiger, bears when we start talking about Russia, and, you know, Persia is, you know, so the men are in sort of, or male countries rather, let me say, are an animal iconography. India is always a sari-clad woman. I think this has to do with a number of things. This has to do with Mother India, right? This has to do with the deification of woman by anti-colonial early nationalists. And here I find myself once again turning to Partha Chatterjee, but Partha Chatterjee's really unparalleled essay that goes back to 1986. And it's the essay, I'm going to forget its title, but it's the piece in which he sort of says, what happens to the woman question? Why does the woman question drop away for the nationalists? And his answer is just brilliant. And he says, what Indian anti-colonial nationalists did in the second half of the century, of the 19th century, is they decided that Britain brought material prosperity. But what India had that was unparalleled was spiritual prosperity, was spiritual health, spirituality. And the second part is that spirituality was located in woman, which of course deifies women, but puts a huge burden on women to be the spiritual holders of the nation. So, okay, that's the backdrop. I mean, the figure for me who is central to this is, of course, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee or Chattopadhyay, right? Bankim is the one who, you know, Vande Mataram. Bankim is the one who was articulated in a print sphere this notion of Mother India that, you know, I think, you know, early 20th century became something that, you know, or let me just put it this way, Indian feminists have spoken for the last 15 or 20 years about the way in which that Mother India is a role that has been deeply damaging for real women. So as women are represented on this pedestal and deified, real women in India, of course, get punished when things don't go so well, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, Julie, does that answer your question?
Yes, I mean, in many cultures, women are raised as allegorical figures while the real women suffer second-class citizenship. That has gone on since ancient Greece. But also the Anglo-Indian press image was of a woman too, wasn't it? Looked like an older woman. I don't know if you can go back to that image. I wonder if it's a match between women and women in some form, because
let me screen share again. Both the last two images were from the Parsi Punch, which is...
So that's a kind of dowdy woman, the kind of image they often use to make anti-suffrage notes about women in Britain or France. So I was curious about these two together. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I honestly, I was focusing on the woman in the sari, but you're right, the sort of granny figure is a way, of course, of, I mean, it's a really negative figure. And actually, now that you say it, and I'm thinking back, the Anglo-Indian press is often in this dowdy woman figure. There's a lot of misogyny, I should say, both in the Indian, this is of course an Indian press, and in the Anglo-Indian illustrated press that I'm coming upon.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Okay, Kathy had a hand up as well.
Yes, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Prithi. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit about the creative process of writing the book, because amongst the many wonderful things about this book, one of the ones that impressed me most is this really strong narrative line that you've got to it, and the way that you kind of dramatize almost your own research methods and the difficulties you had in trying to, where you had gaps in the archive and so on. And it so often reads like a detective, a detective story. I mean, and it was for you clearly in doing the research. So I just wonder how you went about structuring it and writing it in such a way that it had that really urgent narrative drive to it.
Wow, thanks, thanks, Kathy. You know, two things I'll say. I wanted to, I didn't want to write an academic book. I mean, you know, I wanted to write an academic book, but I wanted to write a book that, the way I put it to myself is I wanted to write as a historian does. And I'm not a historian. So I wanted to write a book as historians do that, and of course I wanted to be academic, but I wanted people, all kinds of people to read it, not just a very small number of people. So that was the first thing. And you know, it's a late career book. I had nobody to write it for but myself. And I'm glad if people enjoy it and like it. I'm delighted to hear that. But the second thing I wanted to do in writing it is I wanted the archive to direct me. I did not, I mean, of course we all bring frameworks and ideas, but I wanted the archive to be directing the story I told. I didn't want to, and I really, from day one, when I realized it was a book, which was many years later after doing this research, I mean, it was many, many years later, but when I decided it was going to be a book, I wanted to tell stories, and I used that language in my head. I'm going to tell a story or stories, and I'm going to let the archive decide the story. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I wanted to be a storyteller.
You are, you did.
Excellent. Teja.
Thank you so much, Priti. That's just so wonderful. And I've read your book and I'm going to reread it, I'm sure, again. As I was reading this, I mean, I was sort of staying with two questions. One was sort of how the Anglo-Indian press responded to the project of English language education. I mean, I was thinking about the language question. And the second and a related question is about if, you know, where you speak about it, them responding to the British press, and was there anything here about what kind of British literature was being read and how it was being reviewed and perhaps responded to by readers in India? Because one of the questions that I'm really interested in is the Indian reader, not simply as a political voice, but as responding to English literature. And sorry, just a side question in terms of, you know, something that you turned up, just came to mind in the image that even Julie Fidel spoke about, you know, this notion of the Civil War specifically. It just brought to mind, you know, Amir Mufti's recent book on civilizing war, and the Civil War is almost like a pre-modern, it doesn't happen in England, it happens elsewhere, in the colonies and the sort of violent places in the world. So I'm thinking about, like, so is the Civil War then a pre-modern war that is playing out in colonial modernity in these sort of still savage countries, where the press then has that modernizing role? Yeah, so it seems to sit oddly, right, with that colonial modernity that you so powerfully outlined vis-a-vis the press. Yeah, so these were the questions. So.
Sorry. Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much, Teja. So let me see. So there was a question about education and how the Anglo-Indian press is dealing with the question of education. And you know, the book itself is on 45 to 60, although obviously, you know, I spent a lot of time reading before and after. But by 1845, that question of the introduction of English education, the question that comes up through Macaulay's famous statement, that question, of course, has been settled, right? And again, Gauri Vishwanathan just does a beautiful job in her Masks of Conquest, so I won't sort of repeat it, but that question has been settled, right? English education is coming to India. What you see in the press, in the papers themselves, is, I think, the trail or tales of the Anglicist Orientalist debate, right? So you are seeing people saying, so Lang, for instance, was very, very insistent that the Mufassalite, was very insistent in the Mufassalite that vernacular language training had to occur. So in the early days of the Mufassalite, he actually included their inserts in Urdu script, both in text and sometimes in inserts. So you know, that project clearly failed and went nowhere, right? And towards the second part, the latter part of the period, I'm looking at the Anglicist side, if you will. And of course, Gauri Vishwanathan, blurs those. She says, you know, they're not as different as we think they are. But the Anglicists had won, right? So there was you hear much less of the need for Anglo-Indians to have any training in vernacular languages. What you start to see more of, though, is Hindi and Urdu or Hindustani words making themselves into the body of the text in anglicized. So, or written out in Roman rather than vernacular scripts, rather than Devanagari or any of the other scripts. So that's the education question. The lit question, I have to smile a little bit here because the truth is, I'm a literary scholar. People always say, oh, you're a literary scholar. You're working on newspapers and periodicals. You look at the poetry and fiction. And I'd be like, no. As soon as I got to the poetry and fiction, I'm like, I can skip this. I don't have to read this because I wasn't really interested in the poetry and fiction. That said, right? That said, there's there is a good deal of poetry and fiction, not as much as you would think in these newspapers. Yes, Dickens gets pirated a number of times. You see Thackeray occasionally reprints of pieces by Thackeray, but most of the time what you are getting is literature or poetry by Anglo-Indians. So, and they're usually pseudonyms. So there's much more of that now. And let me just quickly say, this is not in the dailies. The Bengal Harkaru is a daily. You're not seeing much literature and poetry in the Bengal Harkaru. You are seeing that in the Mufassalite, which is twice a week. You are seeing that in some of the weeklies. So Friend of India occasionally, not that often. So it really depends on how the frequency of the newspapers makes a difference.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes. Laurel.
It was a fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you why you weren't interested in the poetry and the fiction.
I knew somebody would ask like that. Just because I was interested in I was interested in what the newspapers were doing, and I wanted to think of them holistically. And I knew that it would be too easy for me as a literary scholar to just sort of turn to the fiction and poetry and get absorbed into it and maybe start thinking, and probably not maybe, almost certainly start thinking of it in terms of, not just is it good, but what is the work it's doing? And instead I wanted to think about the materiality of the newspapers. And I was looking at them on microfilm. So materiality is a different, the holisticness of the newspapers. And I think in some ways, Laura, it's a fantastic question, because I think it marks, that lack of interest marks my movement from being a literary scholar, somebody trained as a literature person, even though I wrote my dissertation on what I call bad novels. But as somebody who was really thinking as a periodical studies scholar, which is thinking of the newspaper as a whole and what it's doing, rather than getting, yeah, please go ahead.
No, well, of course, I've made the same move, right? I mean, from literature to print culture and periodicals. And but of course, the presence of literary work, particularly, as you say, of Anglo-Indians, I mean, Dickens and Thackeray in brackets, it's interesting to hear that they're there. But of course, I couldn't help but be curious, as I would be, in the Anglophone press, of the presence of literature and the literary in the press, whether it's in the newspaper or, I mean, Houghton didn't want to read the poetry and the periodicals because he thought it was, by women, and he thought it was, somehow, subliterary, I suppose, but actually, if you're thinking about the press as a whole, holistically, it is fascinating that material is there. And, I mean, I do think it's part of it. It's like, if I didn't read leaders, or, because I didn't, I wasn't interested in the opinion of the, of the title. I mean, I just think, you wanted to go with the archive, but the archive holistically does include that material. I think we're, I mean, you read Stead, who says, over my dead body, will there be fiction in, my newspaper? But then he includes it, and he includes something called journalistic fiction, which is actually about the, the problems of the day. He asks, journalists to write fiction about current events. They don't want to do it. They don't want to do it. But anyway, you know, it's
Well,
it's
and let me say that maybe I'm a little steady on myself. I mean, I exaggerate a little when I say I didn't read it at all. I mean, of course I
Good.
looked at it. Of course I looked at it. I don't write about it. That is quite true. I don't write about it. You know, this book doesn't include anything on ads because, you know, I was writing along and I hit a wall. I didn't know where to go next. And I realized that the ads were one moment where there were images and kind of broke the text. And so I stopped and I wrote an article on ads and it appeared in RSVP. And I gave it at a conference and I think Margaret Beetham was there wonderfully and gave me feedback. So, I mean, there are lots of things that, you know, are not in the book. Yeah.
okay.
So, but I take your point that I was maybe being a little glib or a little flip. So thank you for correcting me, Laurel.
Well, it's not a correction. I just, you know, there it is, right? Yeah. On the page. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that interesting exchange. And Prithi, I think that there's a really lively conversation going on in the chat too, just about how inspiring it is to hear about your approach to this book and wanting to actually tell a story and weave that in with the academic narrative and the research that you did. And I think that's fantastic. And there's a lot of people who are just wanting to do that same thing. So thank you.
May I just, so I'm not able to follow it because for some reason my little box is not open. Kari, could I ask you to please save that for me and send it to me? Because I'd love to read those comments before we get shut down.
We have been saving all the chats, so they will be there.
Thank you.
Yes, great. Okay. Yeah, so you'll also want to see people thanking you and some other suggestions, Fanula, for another event that touches on some of the same issues. So we really appreciate you presenting your work to us today. If everyone would like to unmute quickly and give Prithi a round of applause. Yay! All right, well, thank you all for sticking with us throughout the day, and I hope to see you back here tomorrow for our final day of the conference. So